So, hello and welcome to week two of the food security, sustainability, and sovereignty module. By this stage in the module, after just 1 week, I'm really hoping that you've undertaken a considerable amount of learning. So, last week we looked at the basic components of what it was to think about the world through a food systems lens. And hopefully, through our broader reflection on the value of systems thinking, it gave you some understanding of why we might take this particular approach towards food. As I suggested last week, then each of our subsequent weeks try to speak to a particular component, maybe, of a food system, or to provide or other information that we can kind of lay over the food systems idea to start developing our own individual and collective ways of analysing food from a systemic point of view, ultimately with the objective, as we always have, of identifying issues that we have reason to believe justify attention, and with the ultimate view to developing some kind of intervention that we think, for some reason, is socially positive. Now, this week, the theme is food regimes. Now, food regimes is a particular literature. I guess it's another approach that's been taken, another conceptual lens that's been used to understand the provision of food on our planet. But what's, I think, interesting about it is it takes a much more historical perspective. So I'd briefly like to introduce the idea of food regimes, and then we can move to thinking in concrete terms about how this might be used. And I'd like to talk about my experiences of living in and researching Panama as a country and a particular region within Panama, to hopefully demonstrate how we can use the ideas of food regimes to bring the world alive, so we can understand it and pursue that mission of intervening positively within it. So I suppose, just as a flag, my main thing that I want to suggest to you is that we can sort of consider the idea of food regimes to be very similar, or at least very congruent, with the idea of taking a systems approach to food. Now, I just want to backtrack a little bit. So this is last week we talked about the sort of conceptual components of taking a systems approach to food, and some of the bits that might be involved. But we also focused on the idea of trying to visualize this. So we're trying to create a visual analytical method to help structure our understanding. So I'm going to try and show you lots of visual examples of food systems analysis, and here is yet another one. It looks quite similar to, I think, examples that I've shown you before, and I think it in fact comes from a similar author as one of the others. And I just want to take for a moment, I haven't looked at this map for a while, so I'm just kind of off the top of my head pick out a few things. So I can see in here that the author of this has given attention to what we might say are the sort of the physical components of a food system. So I can see here a consideration of mapping the issues of transport and waste, maybe a subsystem or subsystems of this larger system. The energy system is mapped in here. The water system is mapped in here. I can see reference to money, and therefore the idea of the sort of the subsystem of finance is nested within this broader systems map. So we've got the physical aspects, we've got the idea of nested systems. I can also see in here some of the socially constructed systems that the author feels is relevant to understanding what is going on. So up at the top, I can see the mapping of political and governance issues. Moving to our right, a recognition that civil security, that's an interesting one, is a concept that plays into this system. And then we've got the concept of food security as a kind of a key concept within this system again. So this is a socially constructed part of it, under which we might, it's hard to see the details, but you might start thinking about food security policy, and if it's specifically framed in that way. So we have these social elements. Moving over to the left, what can we see up here? So we've got a category of science, and I guess, and then that underneath that, the idea of technology. so technological maybe characteristics and drivers of this system, and how this feeds into changes in maybe food security, which could also be an issue of empirical measurement within the system. I also see in here an ecological consideration. So I think maybe we didn't explicitly say, but food systems is inherently interdisciplinary in the way that that it approaches the world, which is another part of the reason why we use it. And here we've got the environmental side. So we've got ecological issues around climate change and what have you. Yeah, so hopefully by this point you're understanding the things we want to be thinking about if we're taking a systems approach. And of course we can see the arrows where the author has attempted to reflect how various factors influence each other. Just finally we've got the actors, so every small, so farmers, etc., etc. So we've got an idea of the interactivity. But now what I want to suggest to you is that if this is our contemporary food system, and maybe this is an abstract representation of empirical reality, this obviously doesn't exist in a bubble. The current food system has come from somewhere, and if we're just thinking about the global food system, it's I hope makes sense, has changed over time to evolve and emerge into what it is now. I'm actually just going to check myself and say I'm not too happy with the word evolve that I've used there, because evolve implies evolution, and evolution often is taken to mean a transition towards something that's more fit for purpose. So actually, I'm going to ask to withdraw that statement, not use evolution, but stick with the idea of a more neutral change over time, because yeah, I'll keep my value judgments to being conscious ones, not unconscious ones. Hiding in the language that comes to my mind. But basically I want to ask the question, well, what's been happening in the past? How have we got here? And how can we understand how this current situation has arisen? Where has it come from? So we might ask, well, what does the historical food systems map look like? But actually, if we're thinking about history, we immediately might want to recognize that it's not a case of there just being one map for the past, but actually maybe there's been multiple food systems maps that might represent what's come before. And this is where the literature of food regimes offers us a structured, conceptually framed way in to think about this. And through drawing on historical analysis, it makes a very specific set of propositions. And it says, in order to think about the contemporary food system, which it conceptualizes as being very much embedded within the development of capitalism. In fact, it's pertinent to say that the food regimes approach arose out of an initial effort to understand the development of capitalism as the broad intellectual project. And it was actually sort of food was almost like a case study of that. So that's where this came from. So it's from a background of Marxist intellectual thought, which we don't need to go into the details of, but one of the characteristics of which is that it thinks about transitions over long historical time, being in a number of stages. So we can see this represented in the food regimes literature, and it suggests that three major stages that have sufficient number of coherent characteristics worth thinking about are the first stage of the development of industrial capitalism. Then later, the idea of a food regime that's labelled as a more commercialised version of capitalism and a capitalist food system. And then into the final stage, which is a corporate capitalist food system, or as it would term it, food regime. Now, the reason that I think food regimes are relevant is when you look into the empirical literature that mainly forms most of well, it forms a lot of this work, we see exactly the same focus of interest as we now understand, hopefully, we have with a food systems approach. So this literature talks about who are the actors involved in these various historical times, how are they interacting with each other. It's also very keen to trace the outcomes of each individual food system, and it does it again in a very interdisciplinary way, we can broadly break that down into it's got a concern with social, environmental, and economic outcomes, maybe different focuses depending on the author's particular line of interest with the case study or the region or the empirical context they're looking at. But I think what the food regimes literature offers us, and that's why I want to introduce you to it as a complement, as a coherent complement to the idea of food systems, is that it thinks very much about drivers of change. And it has a very specific focus that, for me, based on my knowledge, my analysis, make a lot of sense. And it tends to focus on three particular aspects. So it's intensely interested in each of these stages about the accumulation of capital, sort of the aggregate capital, and where in the system and which actors have control over capital. This is fundamentally then interrelated with the idea of technology. You're probably aware that from a Marxist tradition, the idea of capital is I suppose, finance, not accumulated for its own purpose, but with the specific intention of reinvestment into something that then creates more finance and more capital. So Marxists sort of see one of the defining characteristics of capitalism, not just material development and certain economic relationships, but the driver of the system becomes not the fulfillment of needs or even desires, but is pretty much at the core motivated by an interest in certain actors to accumulate more capital for the sake of having capital, to invest it, to accumulate more. And that's what Marxism sees as the motor of historical change over time. So these two themes are very prominent in the food regimes analysis. As part of this, when we're talking about capital, we're talking about technologies, power relations between different actors are really important. And obviously, as we know, that influences the outcomes as to who gets what is prioritized over what. And then kind of drilling down to the more, I guess, minute, micro daily business of the actors, the slow development and solidification and increasing influence of a profit motivation that actors have. And if you now look at our three stages, you can sort of see the idea of maybe profit motivation becoming more prominent from, I guess, sort of more basic capitalist arrangements through a commercializing stage and through to something the stage that is characterized or believed to characterize our food system now, the idea of a corporate controlled. So corporate in terms of legal entities, obviously very much legally hinged upon the profit motivation. So that's the idea of the basic premise of food regimes. Now, hopefully you'll read in much more detail in the various readings about how this might work. So we can think of these in a way as each of these stages as a sort of a food system, but hopefully from the literature and our work, you'll see there's probably just a greater concentration on understanding processes of change, what helps drive us from one characterizable stage to the next, and so on. And of course, hopefully, by understanding change over time, we can see the levers, we can see the direction of travel and the outcomes, and then we can make normative decisions about what kind of outcomes we think are acceptable and appropriate. And then we can understand the sort of the core levers and drivers of change to think about when we might intervene. So while this might seem a kind of an abstract intellectual project, it hopefully has practical opportunities for intervention. So yeah, this could be three global food regimes, or it could be three global food systems. And something to encourage you to do. Academics are always playing with language. So if you work in physics, the product of your research will be a new machine that does something. If you're a social scientist, yes, you can find out new empirical things about the world. Oh, I've turned over this rock that no one's turned over, and I've seen for the first time that something new is going on. But innovation also comes in our conceptual understanding. Now, for me, given my ontological position and my epistemological position, so the way I philosophize what the world is made of and what constitutes knowledge and how we find it out, I'm always interested in what I would identify as conceptual innovations. So we might be looking at the same thing, the same pattern of events, the same behavior, but by putting a different lens in front of our eyes that interprets the world differently, we can maybe change and innovate our ultimate understanding. And that's something that I would encourage you to do. It's important to make reference to literatures and existing concepts that talk about, food systems, and it's good to show knowledge that you have understanding of that prior thought. But there is nothing stopping you, as long as you have your reasons and you signpost it, that you become a bit creative with the way that you use words, and that you intermix existing concepts to create maybe new ways, new lenses to use to look at the world and understand it differently. So that's part of what I want us to try to play with this week, which I think is a fun thing to do. I hope you do. So that's a brief summary. I haven't quite decided what I'm going to ask you guys to do next, but a little bit later on from the audiovisual, I'm going to move to trying to show you how we apply this food regimes idea to a specific empirical context. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be looking at Panama. We're also going to be reading another paper that looks at another specific empirical context, which is the Turks and Caicos Islands. And I think at this stage, I'm going to ask you to do another bit of reading, which thinks about transition and change and drivers of change over time, but from within the context of this kind of Marxist framework with its particular focuses of interest. So hopefully that starts us off. Let's go back to Moodle and you'll be able to see what I've ultimately decided we should do next.